Our next speaker is Estara Arrant. And Ms. Arrant is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, where she works on a project, Codicological and Linguistic Typology of Torah Codices, under supervision of Professor Geoffrey Kahn. And her paper today will be From Scholastic to Scribal, a developmental analysis of unprofessional square Hebrew script from Cairo Genizah Bible fragments. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will share my screen and hopefully technology will be on my side. So thank you for coming to my talk today. Today I will be presenting data that is primarily from my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis, just to summarize very quickly, I dealt with around 1,800 fragments of the Hebrew Bible written by everyday people or for everyday people. So many of them were written by scribes from the Cairo Genizah. And in doing so, and I dealt with the Torah only, but in doing so, I discovered many Bibles that not only were written by children, and they actually had like a codicological format. They weren't just fragments on paper. The Bibles written by children, Bibles written by people who seemed to be not professional scribes, but also the hand seemed more mature than a child's, for example. And there had been very little analysis done at this level from the 11th to 13th centuries. And through my PhD, I classified two levels. I classified what I called an unprofessional level of Bible, as well as an average level of Bible, all before you get to the scribal level. And this paper I'm giving today is my response to the question that came up in my thesis: how do you define an unprofessional script? And how do you, when you're looking at a script, how can you say for certain, yes, I'm looking at an unprofessional hand? And what does this mean? So let's see, how can I continue forward? Yes. So as my talk will be an overview of, I explore these so-called unprofessional and average script level specimens. Unprofessional and average are the terms that I give. I don't feel, I've not seen other people give these terms. I'm sure that it has been used. I'm not saying I'm original here, but and they were in my thesis subjective. And what I'm trying to do in this talk is bring a little bit of objectivity to my assessment. I contextualize it within the wider realm of paleographic inquiry for the medieval period, though I would feel this has some application for earlier or later periods. And Drew Longacre's paper, Disambiguating the Concept of Formality, has been very fundamental in my seeking to give some objectivity to my assertions. So I build upon his theoretical foundation, which is very helpful, and I bring a new nuance to it for the medieval period, since his paper dealt with more egg-ship periods. Finally, my objectives are to systematically describe the positive features of unprofessional Hebrew script and show a developmental trajectory through the educational process, because many of these Bibles were written by children while they were in school, and so you can see the educational process unfolding. So first I will talk about the research background and show how my research relates to the aims of traditional paleography. Primary paleographic goals, as I'm sure we're all aware, but I'll just review them, are first to identify the script type, provenance, and date of an unidentified script. And to do that, we need to be able to compare two scripts that have been dated or provenanced. And therefore, a lot of the paleographic books are building an apparatus of these script styles. Primary focus for the medieval period, I would say, for Bible manuscripts, I'm qualifying other sources. I'm not going to say the focus is the same, but for Bible manuscripts is scribes, especially for more ancient periods, but also for the medieval period. And the result is a stratification of styles you can see and contextualized to instant society. So we have a documentary hand or semi-cursive hand. Yes, I did have Bibles with a semi-cursive hand in my corpus, semi-formal, formal, etc. And an overwhelming focus is on established graphic script styles, which And Alois Slanger's paper has shown our transmitted generation to generation. So a scribe would teach his students, which would teach their students. And that's why you see a perpetuation of styles throughout a few centuries in the Genizah. So this is the primary paleographic foundation which we have. Now, my corpus deals with Bibles which had not really ever been looked at paleographically, and it's a wider corpus, dealt with the impact of widespread literacy. Paleography as a field, to my impression, has always been looking at the writing of scribes who are either, well on in their education or at least educated to a certain degree. But in the Cairo Genizah, because of the easy access to writing material and the necessity for Jewish populations to engage in the bureaucracy of, the Islamic world in which they lived, writing was very common. It was very widespread and normal. There are multiple sources that say this, and we have many instances of it, not just scriptural, but also many instances of signatures being by someone who had a basic education but wasn't a scribe, for example. And the effect is that we have writers in the Genizah who aren't scribes. And I think the foundation of paleography is scribal handwriting, but there's a lot of non-scribal writing that exists. And the corpus that I'm basing my analysis upon today was around 300 fragments of Torah codices, they're written by lay people and children, some of whom were in scribal school, and I will explain why I think that, and some who learned to write and then never continued on and never became scribes, but they were adults. So, and I say they were adults, I mean, we weren't there at the time, but it appears to be. And if you want more evidence of this, an article I published a few years ago about begging letters in the Cairo Genizah, 2 of those letters in that article are written definitely by people who were adults. They weren't written by scribes, they're written by adults asking for bread, and you could tell that they had only had a rudimentary level of education. So that was written by an adult and not a child. I can go forward. This wider level of literacy calls for a fresh look, because we can't just live within the realm of what scribal school was this writing from. We have to look beyond that and widen our perspective, which I think is very interesting. So my analysis has some theoretical considerations. I hope I don't do Drew Longacre's paper injustice. It's a very good paper. I really, really appreciate it, but we'll see how far I go. I find it a helpful heuristic foundation for understanding informal versus formal script. In ancient periods, there was a classification of semi-cursive as informal and semi-formal and informal, and it was not very, according to Drew Longacre and according to myself, I agree that it was not very well categorized, and there needed to be some more clearer logical distinctions. Longacre defines formality as meticulous adherence to a highly structured ideal form considered appropriate for an esteemed textual artifact, which I feel is a very good definition of formality, and I appreciate it. And he classifies informal script as lacking certain key morphological elements, which are the structure of such a meticulous adherence. And that is, it still is, in my opinion, relating to the world of scribes, though you can see from his examples that also non-scribal writers were involved in the analysis. I want to say on this for later periods that that his definition of informal is not just lacking certain morphological elements, but it has an unprofessional aspect as well as a professional aspect, especially for later periods where we have people who were not scribes who were writing. They're informally writing. They're not scribes, so they're unprofessionals. And then we have people who are scribes who can write in an informal register that's not calligraphic. So I want to add a new subcategory to his category of informal. I also argue that informal / unprofessional script, and I should say the subtype of unprofessional script, can have positively identifiable features and is not a negative category. we can say, and you will see me say today, that they lack certain things. I have inconsistency here or inconsistency there, but that you can measure that inconsistency and you can describe the degree of inconsistency. And so therefore I see it as a positive feature. Informal script doesn't just lack, it also has characteristics and qualities which we can name and measure. And Scribiore attempts this for Greco-Roman Greek hands of school children, and I build on that analysis as well. So the paleography I have today has different goals. I'm not trying to compare it to a script style because it's so unprofessional that that's not reliable. My goal is to describe and to identify the level of literacy of the writer. It's not to find a provenance or a date, because that can't really be done since they're not, inheriting yet a datable script style. And I'm taking a new view of an evolutionary view. So not like this is this script style, this is that script style, but where is this along a continuum from completely uneducated to scribal? So these are my new goals. And the part one of my analysis, and I promise I'll be within the time frame, don't worry, is to identify the positive characteristics of informal writing, or unprofessional, as I would say. A few categories of features, I have gotten them out. This is built upon Scribiore's analysis, which is very granular, but I take it to a bit more of a categorical level. So I say there's interletter features. So unprofessional writing will have irregular letter sizes, inconsistency of stroke angles. So the strokes for a certain letter may be going 90 degrees in one letter, and then the same letter a few lines down going a different amount of degrees, and they can't control the stroke angles. On thickness as well, they can't orient the pen to the page and produce the same thickness as a previous letter. And also exaggeration of decorative elements. This is one thing that I've not seen mentioned in paleographic literature on informal and professional writing, is that a decoration can be exaggerated. They think, oh, we need to have a flourish here or a ligature here or extend the letter, and they do it too much because they're not yet trained to have a balanced view. There are interlinear features such as irregular orientation to the guideline. I have seen ruled manuscripts where the child could not follow the ruled line at all. It was amazing how badly that they could do that. And you could see the ruled line very clearly. It wasn't invisible. Irregular orientation of graphemes to other letters and irregular spacing. And one of the other things I don't see mentioned again in paleographic literature is orientation and size of vowels. A lot of paleography is dealt with unvocalized manuscripts, and vocalized manuscripts were really stylistic, really calligraphic hands. The vowel points are so regular that we don't comment on them. But for children learning to vocalize the Hebrew Bible text, the vowel points actually are quite useful for gauging how skilled the child was at writing. And finally, shifting writing registers. So you'll often see in Genizah Bibles, they'll start out with a very nice hand, and as they get tired, either towards the end of the line or later on down, they get more and more lazy. I even found one, I won't have the time to present it today, where at the end of the line, he was writing in Hebrew script, he got tired, the Hebrew script got very bad, and he just switched to Arabic script and started writing the Hebrew Bible in Arabic script and his Arabic script was quite educated. So you see a shifting in writing register, which indicates someone is not a professionally trained scribe. So here is an example of one of these hands. If we look at it, you have the irregularity of letter size. For example, here's an aleph of one size, an aleph of another size, and so forth. You have the inconsistency in stroke angles. So for example, I like aleph because it's a nice letter that you can use for your heuristically to look at features. They're very distinctive, but his stroke angles often don't match up. For example, the stroke angle in this bet is a bit higher than the stroke angle in that, for example, goes a bit downwards. So you see inconsistency in stroke angles or exaggeration of decorative elements. As I'm going through my checklist, sometimes his lameds seem to, he's doing them nicely and long, but then And other times the decoration, like example for here, it seems to be a bit awkward and he hasn't spaced out his line properly. There's the guideline, it's hard to see, there is some ruling in this manuscript. And as you can see, the orientation of the guideline isn't very well established. Also, you can say spacing is completely off and it's not very well made. And finally, the vowels, this is vocalized. So for example, his serre here is at an angle, it doesn't actually fit with the line. So that you can tell that he's a rudimentary writer. He's not really able to keep, or even place, like for instance, right here, he's not able to place the vowel sign directly under the letter. It's kind of angled off to the side, for example. So we can see that this is probably a school child learning Leviticus. That. Here's another example of a far more uneducated person. And you can see, for example, the inconsistency of stroke angles is much greater. For example, look at these three different alepphs. All of them look exactly, they have the same stroke order, but the angles and the ability to make them look similar is not there. There's no ruling, no guideline, no orientation, etc. And no real ability to have a standard shape to his letter. So this is someone who's less educated than this person. Finally, ignore these red bits. I didn't know it would layer over like that. Finally, this is an interesting hand where you can tell that I'm unsure who taught him how to make this aleph, but it's very interesting aleph. But look at the irregularity in the size. So the size of the letters is not, he's not writing them with an eye to other letters. So this is one of the features that you can see. Or for example, one word in the manuscript can be quite large and the next word quite small. There's not very much consistency. So these are some of the descriptive features that you can positively identify in this hand. Some of it's actually, though, calligraphic. I mean, he has some ligatures here that you see in later documentary hands. His ability to abbreviate the Tetragrammaton is actually quite consistent. It's more consistent than the rest of his handwriting, which I find fascinating. So that just to recap, that is me laying out some of the exact qualities that this hand has, these kinds of hands have, but then we want to look at it through a development through the educational process. So for example, for using our script, this is obviously the most uneducated hand that we have. The person is barely able to form a full letter sign. It's not going all the way through. In fact, we can't really call these lines. It's more as they're really trying hard, but they're not able to do so. And then you have a bit more, here he can form a line, he can form letters that form coherent writing, he can vocalize the text, but as he gets tired, his ability to adhere to lines and spacing decreases, and his ability to have a consistent visual effect is not present. Then we have a higher level. Now, someone may mistake this for a scribal hand. I would say this is not a scribal hand. You can see this especially by the inconsistency of orientation of letters to each other. He's exaggerating, for example, right here, he's exaggerating his elongated letters. It's far too large and it takes up more of the line. Or for example, here, this is exaggerated, goes all the way down to the end of the page. So it's far more advanced than these two. It's got some decorative elements. He's got some like lozenges on his aleph, for example, and he can actually have predictable line fillers at the end of the page, which aren't crudely drawn. So it's more this is someone at a higher level than these previous two, but there's no way you would call that professional writing. And finally, you have this hand, which I have classed as average. Why have I classed it as average? I mean, it looks quite sophisticated, but it's not, it's still lacking the finesse you see in more calligraphic Bible manuscripts. This is what I would be on the cusp of fully Scribal. And in fact, we do have evidence of children in their writing books, in the Genizah, copying out script from their teachers, and they're trying to imitate it as closely as possible. And it can be quite difficult to tell the difference between the script of a child and the script who's very educated and the script of his teacher. And so you see some of the inability to keep the straight line is angled. He's got some a little bit of clumsiness, so some of his letters are larger than others, but he does have this nice ornamentation in the lamed, for example, and his koofs are very, very elegantly done. So this person has, of all these, the most education, but he's still in the educational process. And finally, his vowels are very well, for the most part, very well oriented to the word. Sometimes they get a bit mixed up or not so well placed, but they're for the most part, they're much better than, say, the previous one where the vowels aren't so well oriented. So this is a bit of an evolutionary trajectory we see, going from completely uneducated all the way to basically Scribal, but not quite, which is why I think saying unprofessional is a better term, because for example, K5.60, this may have been an adult writing down the parasha for his or her own use, whereas this previous one of Leviticus here was obviously a child's writing, and this one may have been someone's personal Bible. So we see it may not be actually Scribal, but maybe actually personal, and so unprofessional is a adjective I think I would use to describe these Bibles. Summary of my work and the impact of it. The historical period of the Genizah calls for a slightly different paleographic approach because of this widespread literacy. The ability to identify and describe script in terms of education is useful, especially for historians who may be working with documentary texts and want to know the background of the text. If you can describe the background of the education of the writer, you can tell, was this text written by someone who hired a scribe to do it? Did they write it themselves, for example? Future application in fields outside of paleography, for example, challenges in measuring, for example, inconsistency in script for OCR, to read texts, as well as to give a more historical overlay to paleography, I think is important. Certainly being able to classify the educational level of the children who wrote my Bibles assisted me in my thesis, which was not on paleography, what was on codicology and linguistics, to look at their language features, to classify them in other ways. So I think it's a useful tool. And finally, I'm giving some of my sources, and there are others I could give. I think I'm within my time frame. I may be a little short or long, I'm uncertain, but thank you for paying attention to my talk. I appreciate it.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. You're indeed very much in your time frame. So we have a couple.
Was I too short? I'm very sorry.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. Excellent. We have a couple of questions actually, and the first one is from Drew Langeiker.
Estara, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating paper. I'm excited to see the dissertation and what you do with this.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd just like to say I do agree with you completely that professional writers can write informally. So I definitely approve of that category of very skilled writers writing informally. The thing that really is fascinating to me is the positive definition of informal handwriting that you brought out. I really like that in one respect, at least. I mean, when you're thinking of it as a scholar, you're trying to classify formal and informal on a spectrum. It's nice to have a sort of objectively defined and positive feature that you can use to characterize that. And the ones that you brought out are really good, and it comes in and it interacts with some of the papers in the last session. You weren't able to make them, but the idea that informal handwriting is often considerably more variable than formal handwriting, whether that's because of a lack of skill or haste or whatever. And the exaggeration of the decorative elements, I found that really fascinating too, because it's one thing I've kind of seen, but never really formalized it in that way. Because you're right, informal and semi-formal handwriting, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when you look in the semi-formals from the late Roman and early Byzantine period, they're often very exaggerated, these serifs and decorations and things. So I really like that positive definition. My question to you would be, at what level is that operating? Is that kind of an etic classification tool? This is something we notice, and it's a tool based on a cluster of features that we find useful for distinguishing these hands? Or do you think that that's something that is more, I guess the question is it related somehow to the intention? Is it something that people would have recognized, or is it on a different level than this sort of ideal form question?
When you say that, what are you referring to? The exaggeration of decoration?
All of these informal features, when you're trying to give it a positive definition, is this just saying, well, these are some characteristics that happen to be the case? Or is this something that you would suggest can almost be used to characterize these positive as a style in their own right?
I think that's an excellent question. Actually, I didn't want to interrupt you because I have a bad habit of doing that. But I think actually, when I prepared this paper, I just went to my database and picked out some random hands and was able to, using my checklist, just identify all of these features in these hands. I didn't pick these hands on purpose, say, oh, this one has this feature, this one has that feature. My point in saying that is I do think that this positive checklist applies to unprofessional writing as a global characteristic. And that's the point. The article I will be writing is hopefully a guide for people to be able to take any script. They have an intuition. We as people who read manuscripts, they get an intuition, oh, this is unprofessional, this isn't so nice. Well, what vocabulary can we use to describe that? And I'm finding it's pretty universal. I will say I didn't go into the statistics. My thesis did a machine learning analysis where I grouped similar features together, and statistically you could see a clear difference between average, higher educated, but not professional, and unprofessional. It's a clear statistical difference. So I do think that there are enough global features that characterize the corpus at its different evolutionary levels to say that it's not writer by writer, it's actually a style of script, yes.
So you would try to identify then a particular almost informal style of the square script or something to that effect?
Yes.
Oh.
Maybe not too, rigid, but definitely global and reliable.
But that's at the level of modern classification rather than kind of the mental models that these writers might have had. They're not trying to produce these. They just happen to produce these based on their skill sets. And we as scholars can, after the fact, classify that.
Yes, you've got me. You understood me correctly, yes.
Thank you so much, Yang. Wonderful. We have a couple of questions more. The next one is from Gemma Hayes. Gemma?
Okay, thank you.
Our project is probably going to dominate your questions. Thank you very much for your paper. Again, yeah, it was really lovely to listen to you talk about these things. And I agree, I really enjoyed Drew's paper and thinking more broadly about classification and how we use this word formal and informal. So I just feel excited that we're all kind of thinking about this same thing, and hopefully we can kind of together develop it a bit further. So I kind of would like to ask a question about classification, but I don't really have one. I kind of want to ask you two other really short ones. You mentioned the Tetragrammaton and that he was quite, or the child or the writer was quite consistent with that. Is it possible it was a different writer who was using that? Because we have one of these questions with some of the scrolls. And then my other quick question is, you mentioned with one of the manuscripts that as the writer went along, they got tired and hence the writing getting a little bit messier and closer together. But what I was looking at when I saw that was maybe he was running out of space. So I guess I'm wondering, why did you choose to say they were getting tired?
Right. So I don't know how we are in time, so I don't want to. May I share my screen again real quickly to show the Tetragrammaton Hand?
Sure.
Yeah, is that okay?
Sure, go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So here is the hand with the Tetragrammaton. I actually do think it is the same person. If you look at the quality of the yod, here I'll make my pen. If you look at the quality of the yod, it's the same yod.
Okay. Yep.
So I do think it's actually the same person.
Mm-hmm.
As for your other question about the person who, if I can go back. So I had to cut it off in order for it to actually look, there's actually a lot more room. And see these here, it actually is the beginning of his next lob, and he actually goes many centimeters down. So he's getting tired, I think, mid-page, and you can see his writing comes a bit less clear and a bit more crowded together. And then he's got much more room to continue going. So that is my assessment of it. Of course, I could be wrong.
Would you mean like his hands getting tired, or?
Yeah, I do think so. Or if not tired, it's just getting his ability as he keeps going to keep the consistency between the lines. For example, it gets more and more like inconsistent. So as you go on, I think the longer a text you write, the more you will see these things in an educated script. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing. So.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I have a couple of questions more for you, but hopefully we'll have time for that in discussion afterwards.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your questions. I really appreciate it.